As with its predecessors, Half-Life Alyx has quite a lot of cut content from a long and fluid development history, stretching back to the development of the VR tech demo, The Lab. Numerous narrative ideas and gameplay concepts were created and tested to try and bring Half-Life Alyx to life. In reality, it's technically inaccurate for me to call any point of this development a beta or even an alpha, since everything is so fluid. Instead, I shall borrow the community's framing and look at the development of the game in eras of time. This first video will focus on the earliest era in Half-Life Alyx's development, and how it connected to several ideas, projects, and prototypes before that. Unfortunately, we don't have exact dates for everything, so I've organized things as best as I could. This will also only cover officially released content from Valve or their artists. This includes the final hours of Half-Life Alyx, various social media posts, and content that was left behind in the game itself. Around 2016, in the launch of the lab, Valve began to consider what it would be like to do a larger VR title, and considered whether to do it with Portal or Half-Life. What you see in the background is an early, internal demo to test what Half-Life would play and feel like in VR, created at the time. I have a video that I will link to that talks more about it in depth, as well as show the full demo. With the ball beginning to roll on creating a Half-Life VR title, a smaller initial team would come together to begin brainstorming what this could look like, with numerous disconnected ideas. A group of employees formed into a working group called the Story Cabal, and all these ideas were quickly organized into a rough spine for the game. A prequel starring Alyx, with Striders, an under-construction Citadel, the G-Man, and the Combine in City 17. The Cabal would work this into a more detailed narrative for Half-Life Alyx. This narrative would become a solid anchor for the game's first year or so of development, leading into 2017. This is what I call the Cabal Era. As part of their initial work on Alyx, the now growing team would return to Viktor Antonov's original reference photos for Half-Life 2. The original idea was that Alyx was to mostly reuse assets from Half-Life 2 in its episodes. Dozens of these assets remain in the game, and some are even used in various retail levels. Valve early on conducted numerous tests with these assets.
Some of our earliest experiments on the project involved placing old Half-Life 2 models in a level and walking around them in VR. These included static models of enemies, like Combine soldiers or zombies. We found that players really enjoyed being able to inspect these models, because VR let them get much closer than they'd been able to in the past. Players reported getting a sense of the true size of the characters, and would often point out details that they had never noticed before, even though they had seen these models many times throughout Half-Life 2.
Over the course of the game's full development, new and updated assets were steadily being created to replace those older ones, or better represent their newer ideas. What wasn't remade was also taken from a cut Half-Life themed minigame for the lab. It was called Shooter, and numerous assets remain in the retail title and were actively used throughout the game. I have a video about that as well, which is also linked. These pre-existing assets would also inform some of the concept art, and thus some of that narrative that the Cabal had created for the game. That narrative can be found here. You were to begin in City 17. The Citadel is under construction, Dr. Breen having his very first PR broadcast. This was because the Combine were intended to be less established on Earth at the time. Tristan Reedford explains that this even applied to their architecture, which would require more assistance from pre-existing human buildings. Issues with portal storms were still ongoing. A bit of this City 17 was built, as Valve wanted to get into making levels quick. It appears here for some concept art of the Citadel.
Large, sweeping vistas such as this one proved an interesting challenge in virtual reality. Their distance from the viewer means they don't benefit from stereoscopic vision the way that small, close-up objects do, Because of this, the small objects on the balcony often draw the attention of the players before they've even noticed the imposing structure in the distance. If we moved the citadel too close, it felt absurdly huge and difficult to take in. Yet placed alone on the horizon, it felt two-dimensional and flat. We found the solution in filling the space between the viewer and the distant structure with many scale references. The city itself, huge supply cables leading towards the vanishing point, large repeated combine buildings, heavy pollution fog, careful lighting, and all the animated elements, especially the helicopter whose sound begins in the
There's to be some sort of lab there, and you're to also visit a person named Laszlo, who'd give you permission to go into the quarantine zone to hunt for a message left behind by a Vortigaunt cut off from the Vortessence. Laszlo is who would eventually become Russell. Most of the assets that make up Russell himself in the retail title are still named Laszlo. From Laszlo's, you are to head to the edge of the quarantine zone and head underground to find this Vortigaunt. After meeting with this Vortigaunt, you are to enter the zone properly, before catching a razor train deeper into it. One of the points of portal storm activity was supposed to be here in the zone. The quarantine zone, and likely City 17 generally, were going to be quite run down. At the end of the line was some sort of citizen to encounter. There, you were to jump into a portal, taking you into a Zen-infested hotel. There appears to be some particle effects remaining in the retail game for this teleportation. The name Tentacle in the effects appears to be connected to this piece of concept art of a tentacle with some sort of electricity effect. And while I can't confirm it 100%, this concept art of a Zen-infested interior features a bright glowing spot in the center, which appears to be quite similar to these effects in the description of a Zen hotel.
Breaching the quarantine zone revealed a new hidden secret of the city. Alien plant life from Zen has taken root on Earth and has been thriving in the shadows of City 17. On the development team, the Northern Star Hotel was referred to as Hotel Zen before it had a proper name in the story, as it was the first location we used to explore what Zen foliage could look like and how it might consume any given environment.
After surviving the hotel, you're to wander the courtyards of some lower-rise buildings and acquire some sort of disguise to approach the vault. You'd also have to navigate some tunnels and caves. The vault would connect to an above-ground parking garage and was suspended over a large crater that was expanding. The vault itself was built into a partially destroyed apartment building, and its remains considered garbage below it. The interior sequence for the vault isn't on this whiteboard, but it was concepted out by Jim Murray. Once inside the vault, you're to be presented with some strict Combine infrastructure. After figuring out how to open it, you'd be presented with a red door. Going through this door would begin a journey through several areas from Half-Life 2 and Episode 2. Each time, you'd open more red doors to get to each area. Finally, you would reach a point where these areas started to break down and mold into one. A distraught G-Man sitting in a ruined kitchen among it all. Actual work on this ending would begin in the summer of 2017 by Dario Casali. Taking Jim Murray's art as inspiration, some of these ideas were brought to life. Particle effects and a special G-Man model were built for it.
When building a Half-Life game, we try to start playtesting as soon as we can, even when we only have 10 or 15 minutes of gameplay built. We find it extremely helpful to see how players are reacting to what we've made as soon as possible. One of the major ways playtesting impacted Half-Life Alyx was in revealing how players reacted to the density of interactive elements in the world. Before we began, we were already aware that players would likely spend more time paying attention to the details of the world around them in VR, but we were unprepared for how significant this would be. Seeing some players spend 30 minutes messing around with a single interactive object really opened our eyes. As a result of those playtesting observations, we spend much of our development time focusing on the environment around the player and the level of details and interactivity to be found there. It might seem surprising that we didn't start with the assumption that we would need to spend that amount of time on the world, but the reality of game development is that we always have a finite amount of time to build a game and we're always making trade-offs. In the ideal case, we spend our finite time on whatever contributes the most to the player's experience. So, playtesting early and thereby getting a better sense of what elements are contributing to the player experience help us understand where to spend the limited time we have. In this case, those early playtests told us to significantly increase the amount we should budget for creating the world details and interactivity.
Even in our earliest experiments in bringing Half-Life to VR, we found that players enjoyed exploring every nook and cranny of the environment. With the increased fidelity of VR, players not only expected to be able to interact with a vast array of objects, but they also had a strong desire to find something useful from time to time. This was so universal among testers that in addition to more searchable locations and interactive objects, we added a new resource, resin. Level designers could place this new resource in fun and interesting locations that weren't tied to game progression, rewarding players wider-ranging exploration. We also tied this new resource to a longer-term goal in the form of weapon upgrades, further motivating players to explore the environment. Deep scavenger hunts and keen observation would result in more resin to spend as a reward.
We knew from previous VR projects that players would expect a high level of fidelity from the interactions with objects in the world, and during early testing of Half-Life Alyx, we received comments that objects were not making the sounds that players expected, given an object's material, size, and assumed weight. This led us to a more granular approach to physics sounds than we had used in prior products. For example, in the past we would have used a single physics sound for all objects of a certain size and material. So we would have had one sound to represent collisions of small metal objects, another sound for large wooden objects, and so on. For Half-Life Alyx, we built up a new library of object-specific sounds so that we could distinguish between similar objects, like a piece of silverware and a small metal can.
At the same time as all of this, some ideas surrounding the Combine were being investigated. The soldier would be the base for other new infantry to be developed. A Source 2 port of its model was originally developed for Shooter 2, but it would be temporarily repurposed for Half-Life Alyx. As you can see here, the model remains in the retail game, though without its body textures. A remade skin for the shotgunner from the older titles is in the game, suggesting that it would have also returned as an enemy. The new infantry, as previously mentioned, were similar recolors: a green suppressor soldier and a yellow commander soldier. While the soldiers in Shooter reused their Half-Life 2 dialogue, it appears there were experiments at doing new dialogue for these soldiers. This newer take remains in the retail title.
Leader 0, suppressing. Sector is secure, no vision. Ripcord. Target Freeman 3, go active intercept. Overwatch orders 3 CC stim boost. Visual 1 exogens. Call contact, parasitics.
Squad's Soldier AI has been a mainstay of the Half-Life series, so we were excited to see how their design would be impacted by the move to VR. Our early playtesting against a Half-Life 2 Combine Soldier AI in VR immediately made a number of things clear. First, players did not like to be shot at, and often had a visceral, negative response. The soldiers frequently ran at players at full speed, firing all the while, and we discovered that the speed of Half-Life 2 combat was simply too overwhelming in VR. Also, players took longer to do everything in VR, especially the core action of spotting and aiming their weapon at an enemy while staying in cover. As a result, the soldiers tended to live much longer in VR than they did in Half-Life 2. It was clear from these early playtests that the most common reaction among players was to immediately seek cover from enemy fire. So we started experimenting with changes to the Soldier AI, aimed at building a combat experience around players' tendency to seek cover. Early experiments were focused on keeping Combine soldiers at a comfortable distance from the player, while keeping them moving around enough to not have combat become too static. To create lulls in firing for players to peek out from cover, we prevented soldiers from shooting while on the run in most cases. To keep players from remaining stationary, we created a concept of flushing, where squads will attempt to flush the player out of cover. But even in these early tests, it was also clear that players weren't capable of fighting soldiers until they'd gotten skilled in a number of basic combat actions, like reloading their gun without having to focus all their attention on it.
This combat arena that loops back over itself as the player winds through the tenement buildings was one of the earliest test maps built when we began adding Combine soldiers to Half-Life Alyx. One of the lessons we learned from this series of combat encounters was that fighting Combine soldiers was physically taxing on players, as we needed to pay careful attention to pacing. Taking cover, reloading, switching weapons, and acquiring targets really pushed on all the skills that players had learned up until this point. To help cut down on fatigue, we added gaps between the Combine encounters and removed some of the combat altogether to better pace the experience.
What was likely another shooter enemy was the Metrocop, which appears here in this concept art. The Metrocop would make it into retail. New Combine vehicles were also being explored, this giant fortress on wheels being one of them. There was also this new Combine APC design.
Early incarnations of manhacks were frustrating to fight in VR, since their audio was not providing enough information about their location. They seemed to appear from nowhere, and, even when close to the player, they lacked a dramatic presence. We tried a variety of layered sounds with varying distance fall-offs, but this often created more confusion, especially when multiple manhacks were nearby. Our ultimate solution to the problem consisted of two parts. The first was to make manhacks emit the following alarm-like warning sound when they first came into range or were deployed by a Combine soldier. The second part of our solution was to add more aggressive looping sounds with short fall-off distances. The short fall-off of these sound loops meant that this specific component of manhack's sound treatment would only be audible quite near the player. Thus, when players heard these sounds, they knew that manhacks had begun hunting them, and one or more was getting close enough to be of concern.
The Strider in VR tests was a big hit, spurring further development toward including it in-game.
5 years ago, we placed playtesters beneath an idling Half-Life 2 Strider. It was a really simple prototype, but the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. This experience convinced us we should pursue a Strider encounter in VR. And as a result, we built dozens of prototypes over the next few years. Some designs pressed playtesters into very close contact with the Strider. Some had a Strider chase them through a simple environment, or shoot at them through porous cover. In other cases, the Strider would destroy a wall the player was hiding behind or give a performance the player was meant to observe. A prototype built in 2017 squared the player directly off with a Strider in a quarry, combining many of our ideas into one experience.
good. Yeah. Okay. Stay down.
Valve planned a small subset of weapons, one of which was going to be a new high-poly version of Alyx's gun, from a cut version of Episode 3. As you saw, the grenade shooting function was an early idea too, though it was originally going to be with Alyx's gun, rather than the shotgun.
We got a lot of positive feedback from our initial experiments requiring players to perform a series of physical actions to reload the pistol. Specifically, ejecting the clip, retrieving a new clip from their backpack, inserting the clip into the gun, and chambering around. Players enjoyed learning and improving at this skill. We experimented with using a single button for both ejecting a clip and chambering around, but we found that assigning these operations to two different buttons was more interesting, even though it was more mentally taxing. In fact, it was more interesting precisely because it was more mentally taxing, as players would frequently mix up the buttons under pressure.
A slingshot and a shield were also tested, but weren't left in the retail game. Upgrades were also a feature conceived early on. A rocket launcher was considered, and 2 rocket launcher upgrades were created and still remain in the game, though without models. Two-handed weapons were one idea, including a grenade with a pin you had to pull with your other hand.
But our experiments with two-handed VR weaponry didn't reach a level we were satisfied with. When holding a two-handed object in real life, the object itself provides a physical connection between the two hands, and that constraint allows players to stop thinking about it consciously, in addition to providing physical feedback. In VR, without that connection or feedback, we found that players had to keep maintaining their own internal sense of how they were holding their two-handed weapon, or they dripped their hands into positions that were hard for us to reconcile. As a result, our two-handed weapons required players to play along more than we liked. Since one of our core goals with Half-Life Alyx was to allow players to fully immerse themselves by ceasing to think about what they were doing in real life, we decided to focus on single-handed weapons.
Early on in the project, we spent some time experimenting with the classic Half-Life crowbar. Playtests showed us that it was an interesting tool for our player to use in puzzles and world interactions, but we weren't very happy with how our melee combat efforts turned out. We felt it was really important that the crowbar was solid to the world and enemies, and that resulted in some tricky physics challenges. Players could easily push the crowbar into an enemy in front of them because nothing in the real world would stop it. Indeed, without that real-world physical feedback, we found playtesters exhibited a wide variety of swing behaviors. Some would waggle the controller rapidly, others would put their whole body into it. At the same time, playtest response to our pistol prototype was very positive, especially around the more complex reloading mechanics. Faced with a potentially significant R&D problem in melee combat, we chose to refocus our efforts on ranged combat. It also didn't help that players all associated the crowbar with Gordon Freeman, not Alyx Vance.
There was some consideration to have the crowbar break, as there are remaining particle effects for it shattering. A minigame surrounding Alyx's hacking skills would have seen the player grab manhacks out of the air and hack into them via a spherical hacking system. This spherical hacking system would carry into the retail title.
In prior Half-Life games, while playing as Gordon, the player saw Alyx use her multi-tool to hack into Combine security systems in order to unlock doors or perform other acts of sabotage. This presented an opportunity for us to represent Alyx's hacking skills through VR-centric minigames. All of our hacking minigame designs were built to leverage the independently tracked head and hands common to today's VR systems. We wanted to encourage players to use both hands simultaneously and move their head to create parallax to understand the spatial relationships within the puzzles. This locker hacking puzzle is based upon one of our earliest prototypes, in which the player was tasked with using a tool in one hand to paint a path on a sphere held by the other hand.
In our early prototypes, players could heal themselves by grabbing a Half-Life 2 health pack and pressing down on a controller button, which obviously wasn't a very interesting VR interaction. During the development of Half-Life Alyx, the Counter-Strike team added health injectors into CSGO as part of the new Danger Zone game mode they were developing. When we saw this, we felt that an injector would work well as an intuitive healing item in VR as well.
The blind zombie, what would become Jeff, was an idea beginning here in the Cabal Era. In the middle of those VR tests with Half-Life 2 assets, Valve noticed the positive reactions of getting up close to those models.
These reactions led us to the idea of creating an enemy that took advantage of that experience, one that required players to spend long periods of time in close physical proximity to it. But enemies typically don't let the player get near them without attacking, so we felt it made fictional sense for this enemy to be blind, and to feature non-combat gameplay as its focus. Early experiments with guiding a blind creature using sounds were immediately interesting, and gave us a way to create scenarios unique to the product. Thus, the concept for Jeff, known as the blind zombie internally, was born.
The very first, non-original model for Jeff was a standard zombie.
Jeff's character design went through several significant revisions over the course of development. Just by looking at him, we wanted players to understand certain things about the character. Our first priority was to communicate his blindness. Second, we wanted the character to feel physically imposing. After all, the entire concept of Jeff had grown out of our observation that just being close to a character in VR could make for a powerful experience. Finally, we wanted players to understand the blind zombie's behavioural state at a glance. Is he feeling angry? Did he just hear something and is feeling curious? And so on. The first design that we modelled and animated was a sort of combine worker robot. The robot's face featured a holographic display that could flip between different icons that represented its state. A large piece of rebar jutted out of the back of the robot's head, sparking electricity and spewing smoke. This was meant to demonstrate that its visual sensors were impaired, making it blind. We made the robot tall and hulking. It looked heavy, unpredictable and dangerous. However, player reactions to this robotic design showed that it had problems. Players would initially focus on the head's holographic display. Parsing the face and understanding the meaning of the icons proved too challenging for players, and even worse, this element distracted from the rebar poking through the robot's head and their understanding that it was blind. Players found the robot imposing, but we weren't getting the deeply visceral reaction of fear that was desired.
Some other early design ideas for this sequence included a flooded basement.
It was vital that players always be able to identify the cause and effect of a noise that might attract Jeff. Failing this meant players were left feeling like Jeff acted randomly and they'd grow frustrated. Some experiments failed in this area. At one point, parts of the level were littered with piles of broken glass that would make noise if the player walked or teleported over them. Few players would notice the broken glass and were then surprised when Jeff attacked, so this concept was cut to avoid confusion. We had to be wary of the opposite case too, where players would expect purely aesthetic elements to present a noise hazard. For example, at one point we had placed shallow pools of water seeping in among the floor tiles. It looked really cool, but it confused some of our playtesters who thought that the sound of their footsteps splashing through these puddles would be audible to Jeff, even though we never intended that to be the case.
In some of our early experiments bringing Half-Life 2 enemies to VR, we found that antlions in particular showed promise and were interesting to fight, but tended to quickly overwhelm playtesters. They were able to get into the player's physical space too quickly, and applied so much pressure that players just ended up endlessly teleporting around trying to get away.
There are a ton of test particle effects left in the game, for all sorts of things. While some of these were created far beyond the time frame in this video, some appear to be extremely early tests for elements that would later go on into the game. You can also find this turret, referred to as a citizen battery turret. It has a full skeleton and the ability to look in any direction. There's also a sound labeled 2017 still in the game. Cabal Era would come to a close when a full and proper script was created for Half-Life Alyx by Rob Yescombe sometime during 2017 through to 2018. While this script would receive some changes from its original penning, it would essentially crystallize into the central plot that the game was developed with in mind, to the point that specific assets were being created to bring it to life. And thus, the loop era of the game's development began. We also have a good idea as to what was not included in the Cabal Era, explicitly because we know they were added later on. Larry, Olga, and the scientists were all created after the aforementioned loop era. Laszlo didn't speak to Alyx over the radio, like Russell would either, as that was also added much later on. There were also debates on how much Alyx herself would talk, though it was seemingly going to be very sparse.